Does Sarah have the baby in Outer Banks Season 5? Sarah and John B's ending explained. Warning: major spoilers for Outer Banks Season 5. Sarah Cameron's pregnancy from Season 4 continues into the final season, but Sarah does not give birth during the main events of Season 5. Her pregnancy is instead used as an important part of her and John B's future, and helps show how their relationship has changed from the beginning of the series. So, does Sarah have her baby in Outer Banks Season 5? This was one of the biggest questions going into the final season. At the end of Season 4, Sarah Cameron dropped a huge bombshell on John B. She was pregnant. And considering everything that had happened to the Pogues, fans immediately started wondering how the show could possibly fit a pregnancy into its final season. Would Sarah give birth? Would the baby become part of the treasure hunt? Would John B finally stop risking his life? Or would the writers somehow use the blue crown to change everything? Now that Season 5 has arrived, we can finally explain what happens. And the answer is a little different from what many fans expected. Sarah's pregnancy begins in Season 4. Let's go back to where this storyline started. In Season 4, Sarah and John B are married in their own unconventional way. They're still young, but they've already been through an extraordinary amount together. They've survived treasure hunts, kidnappings, shootings, betrayals, storms, and even being stranded far from home. But Sarah isn't necessarily ready to become a mother. In fact, she makes that very clear. She doesn't think she's ready for a baby. And that makes the pregnancy reveal even more surprising. Sarah eventually realizes something is wrong. She's unusually tired.
She's worried.
And she buys pregnancy tests. She takes 2 tests and both are positive. Sarah is pregnant with John B's baby. Netflix's own recap confirms that Sarah discovers the pregnancy in Season 4, Episode 7, and later tells John B the news. John B is shocked, but instead of panicking, he reassures her. He tells her that they've always figured things out together. And that's actually an important moment for their relationship, because John B has spent most of the series chasing his next adventure. Sarah's pregnancy forces him to start thinking about something beyond treasure. A future. Why did the writers make Sarah pregnant? This wasn't simply a random twist. The Outer Banks creators have explained why they decided to give Sarah a pregnancy storyline. Josh Pate said that Sarah had previously told John B that she wasn't ready for a baby. His response to why they gave her the pregnancy storyline was essentially that this was exactly why they did it. The creators also explained that they viewed the pregnancy as the next stage of Sarah and John B's relationship. That is important. The pregnancy isn't necessarily meant to become the main story of the show. Instead, it represents growing up. John B and Sarah began Outer Banks as teenagers. They were running away from parents, chasing treasure, and making decisions without thinking too far into the future. By Season 5, they're facing adult responsibilities. And Sarah's pregnancy is one of the clearest signs of that transition. Does Sarah give birth in Season 5? This is where we need to be very precise. No, Sarah does not have a major childbirth storyline during the main Season 5 adventure. The season doesn't suddenly turn into a hospital drama where Sarah goes into labor while the Pogues are fighting their enemies. Instead, her pregnancy remains part of the larger story. And that actually makes sense when you consider the timeline. The events of Season 5 pick up relatively soon after the events of Season 4. Sarah isn't suddenly 9 months pregnant. The show also doesn't make her wear an enormous baby bump throughout filming. Madeline Klein previously explained that she specifically asked the production not to give her a large pregnancy bump because filming in South Carolina during the summer heat would have been extremely difficult. So the show handles the pregnancy more subtly. Sarah is pregnant. John B knows. The Pogues know. And it affects how Sarah thinks about the future. But it isn't the entire story. Why doesn't Sarah give birth? There is a practical storytelling reason. Season 5 is the final season of Outer Banks. The main story is about JJ's death, Chandler Groff, the Blue Crown, and the Pogues' final adventure. Netflix's official Season 5 setup describes the group as dealing with JJ's death while pursuing revenge and trying to find peace. Adding an entire childbirth storyline would completely change the tone. Imagine Sarah going into labor while John B and the others are trying to survive an international treasure hunt. It would be dramatic, but it would also distract from the actual ending. Instead, the pregnancy functions as a symbol of what comes after the adventure. That's the important part. The Pogues have spent years running towards something: treasure, money, revenge, freedom. But Sarah's pregnancy forces John B to think about what happens when all of that is over. What does the baby mean for John B? The baby represents the future John B never thought he would have. At the beginning of the series, John B is primarily focused on finding his father. He's obsessed with the Royal Merchant Gold. His life is defined by the past: his father's disappearance, his family's history, the treasure. But by the end, he has something completely different to think about: his own family,
Sarah,
their child, and the life they could build together. That's a major character change. John B isn't abandoning the adventurous person he has always been, but he's beginning to understand that he can't spend the rest of his life chasing danger. Soon, there will be someone depending on him. And that's why Sarah's pregnancy fits into the ending. It's not really about the baby. It's about John B growing up. Does Sarah keep the baby?
Yes.
The storyline is ultimately treated as Sarah and John B moving forward together. The creators have said that they discussed different possible outcomes for the pregnancy during development. But they ultimately decided that Sarah and John B were devoted to each other and that the pregnancy represented the next stage of their relationship. So there isn't a storyline where Sarah suddenly decides she doesn't want the baby. Instead, she gradually begins accepting the idea of becoming a mother. And John B is preparing to become a father. That gives their relationship a much more mature direction. What about the Pogues? Sarah's pregnancy also changes the dynamic within the group. The Pogues have always treated each other like family, but now their group is changing. JJ is gone.
Kiara is grieving.
Pope and Cleo are thinking about their future. Rafe is unexpectedly working alongside them. And Sarah and John B are preparing for parenthood. It's no longer a group of teenagers who can simply jump into another treasure hunt without thinking about consequences. They've grown up. And that's one of the central themes of the final season. The Pogues are becoming adults. Does JJ's death affect Sarah's pregnancy story? Absolutely. JJ's death makes the idea of family even more important. JJ was effectively part of the Pogues family. He was John B's best friend. He was Kiara's love. He was someone who had spent years fighting alongside the group. Then suddenly he's gone. Sarah's pregnancy therefore creates an interesting contrast. One life is beginning. Another has been lost. The final season constantly balances those two ideas: life and death, loss and hope, the past and the future. JJ's death forces the Pogues to confront what they've lost. Sarah's pregnancy forces them to think about what comes next. And that's why the pregnancy is more important thematically than it may appear. Does John B become a father by the finale? The important distinction is between becoming a father and seeing the baby being born. John B is already preparing for fatherhood during the season. But the main Season 5 storyline doesn't revolve around Sarah giving birth. The pregnancy is essentially part of the future that awaits them after the treasure hunt and revenge story are finished. And that is actually fitting. The original series has always been about the characters trying to reach some better future. John B wanted answers about his father. Sarah wanted freedom from her family. Kiara wanted to escape expectations. Pope wanted to prove himself. JJ wanted a real family. Cleo wanted security. Now, by the end, they're finally looking beyond the next treasure. They're looking at the lives they can build. What happens to Sarah and John B? Their relationship ultimately gets a hopeful ending. After everything they've survived, Sarah and John B remain together. And the pregnancy becomes part of their future. They aren't simply going back to being the teenagers from Season 1. They've changed. They're older. They've experienced loss. And they're preparing to raise a child. That gives their story a sense of closure. John B began the series searching for his father. He ends it looking toward his own future as a father. That's a pretty significant full-circle moment. Could the baby appear in a future Outer Banks story? This is where things get interesting. The original Outer Banks story is finished with Season 5. But the universe isn't necessarily disappearing. The creators are developing a prequel series called Kildare, set roughly 20 years before the original story and focused on the origins of the Pogue divide. That means any future Outer Banks project would likely move in a different direction. A sequel about John B's child isn't currently the announced project. But the fact that Sarah's baby exists gives the franchise another possible future generation if Netflix and the creators ever wanted to explore one. For now, however, that remains speculation. So, does Sarah have the baby? The short answer is no. Sarah does not give birth during the main events of Outer Banks Season 5. She remains pregnant, and the pregnancy becomes part of the future she and John B are building together. The writers use the storyline to show that the Pogues are growing up. John B is no longer simply chasing treasure. Sarah is no longer simply trying to escape her family. They're preparing for a completely different chapter of their lives. And that's important because Outer Banks has always been a coming-of-age story, hidden inside a treasure hunt. At the beginning, the characters thought the ultimate prize was money. Then they thought it was gold. Then it was the cross. Then El Dorado. Then the blue crown. But eventually, they learned that the real prize isn't treasure at all. It's having people you love and a future worth protecting. Sarah's pregnancy represents exactly that. After years of running, fighting, and searching, she and John B finally have something that isn't buried underground or hidden in an ancient map. They have a future. And while we don't get a big childbirth scene during Season 5, the implication is clear. The Pogues treasure hunting days may be over. JJ's story has ended.